In the rolling hills of North Yorkshire, 15 miles northeast of the ancient city of York, stands one of England's most magnificent country houses. Castle Howard rises from the landscape like a palace from a dream, its golden stone glowing in the English sunlight, crowned by a dome that can be seen for miles across the Yorkshire countryside. But beneath the grandeur and baroque splendor lies a story far darker than the elegant facade suggests. This is a tale of ambition so fierce it consumed lives, of a fire that nearly destroyed everything, and of a family whose rise to power was paved with the blood of queens. The story begins not in the 17th century, when Castle Howard was built, but centuries earlier, with a family whose name would become synonymous with both glory and catastrophe. The Howards were not always dukes and earls. They started as Norfolk gentry, ambitious men who understood that proximity to power was the most dangerous game in England. But it was a game they played with ruthless skill. The Howard family's ascent began at Bosworth Field in 1485, when John Howard fought to the death defending Richard III against Henry Tudor. He lost his life, but his family gained something more valuable than survival. They gained notice. The new Tudor dynasty needed capable men, and the Howards, despite backing the losing side, proved too useful to destroy. They were given a second chance, and they seized it with both hands. Over the following decades, the Howards clawed their way back to prominence. They became the Dukes of Norfolk, the premier dukes of England, holders of the ancient office of Earl Marshal. They organized coronations and royal funerals. They commanded armies and controlled vast estates. But their greatest asset, and their greatest curse, was their women. The Howard women were beautiful, clever, and utterly disposable in the brutal calculus of Tudor politics. Anne Boleyn, through her mother Elizabeth Howard, was a niece to the 3rd Duke of Norfolk. When she caught the eye of King Henry VIII in the late 1520s, the Howard family backed her rise with everything they had. A Howard queen meant Howard power, Howard wealth, Howard influence radiating from the throne itself. For a brief, glorious moment it worked. Anne Boleyn became Queen of England. She gave Henry a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. The Howards stood at the pinnacle of power, their enemies crushed, their fortunes secured. But Anne was dangerous. She was too clever, too independent, too willing to challenge the king who had broken with Rome itself to marry her. When Henry tired of her, when she failed to give him a son, the Howards did not save her. The 3rd Duke of Norfolk himself presided over Anne Boleyn's trial in 1536, his own niece. He sat in judgment as she was accused of adultery, treason, and incest. He showed no mercy. Anne Boleyn went to the scaffold on Tower Green, and the Howards barely paused to mourn before positioning another Howard woman in the king's bed. Catherine Howard was young, barely out of her teens, when she caught Henry's eye in 1540. She was the daughter of the Duke's younger brother, Edmund Howard, a poor relation raised in the chaotic household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. There, away from watchful eyes, Catherine had conducted relationships with young men, relationships that would later doom her. But in 1540, all Henry saw was a pretty girl who made him feel young again. He married her, and once again, a Howard became Queen of England. For the Howard family, it was a second chance at the ultimate prize. But Catherine was not Anne. She lacked Anne's intelligence and political cunning. Worse, she could not escape her past. Within 2 years, her previous relationships came to light. Then came whispers of adultery during her marriage. Whether true or not hardly mattered. In Tudor England, even the rumor of a queen's infidelity was treason. Catherine Howard was executed in 1542, her head struck from her body on the same scaffold where Anne Boleyn had died 6 years before. 2 Howard queens, 2 executions. The family had gambled everything twice, and twice they had lost. They had traded their daughters and nieces like pawns in a chess game, and when the gambit failed, they had not saved them. The 3rd Duke of Norfolk himself narrowly escaped execution. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London, his death warrant signed by Henry VIII. Only the king's own death the night before Norfolk's scheduled execution saved him. He would spend the entirety of the next reign, that of the boy King Edward VI, locked in the Tower. But the Howards survived. They always survived. When Mary Tudor took the throne in 1553, the Duke was released. The family clawed back their estates, their titles, their position. They bent like reeds in the wind, swaying with each change of monarch, each shift in the religious settlement that tore England apart in the 16th century. They were Catholic when it suited them, Protestant when necessary, always adapting, always enduring. By the time the 17th century dawned, the Howards had fractured into numerous branches. The main line remained Dukes of Norfolk, but cadet branches spread across England, each seeking their own path to power and prosperity. One of these branches would create something that outlasted all the executions and political machinations, something that still stands today as a monument to ambition and architectural genius. Charles Howard, the third Earl of Carlisle, was born in 1669 into a family that had learned hard lessons about power. He was not in the direct line to the dukedom, but he was a Howard, and Howards were expected to be magnificent. When his family's old castle at Henderskelf burned down in the late 17th century, Charles decided not simply to rebuild. He decided to create a palace that would dwarf anything else in the north of England. There was just one problem. Charles Howard knew nothing about architecture, and in 1699, when he decided to build his palace, he made the most audacious choice imaginable. He hired as his architect a man who had never built anything in his life. John Vanbrugh was a playwright. He wrote comedies for the London stage, witty and bawdy, popular with audiences who appreciated clever wordplay and risque humor. He had no training in architecture, no experience with construction, no qualification whatsoever for the task of designing one of England's greatest houses. But he had charm, confidence, and vision. And Charles Howard was willing to take the risk. Vanbrugh understood instinctively what Charles wanted, not just a house, but a statement. A declaration carved in stone that the Howards were not merely survivors, but conquerors. He designed Castle Howard in the baroque style, monumental and theatrical, more palace than house. A central dome would rise above the structure, visible for miles, crowning the achievement. Two great wings would stretch out on either side, embracing formal gardens and parkland. But Vanbrugh was wise enough to know his limitations. He brought in Nicholas Hawksmoor, who had worked as deputy to the great Sir Christopher Wren himself. Hawksmoor had the technical knowledge that Vanbrugh lacked. Together, they began construction in 1701, and what rose from the Yorkshire earth over the following decades was nothing short of extraordinary. The work proceeded slowly. The east wing took 3 years to complete, from 1701 to 1703. The dome, that crowning glory that Vanbrugh added to the design partway through construction, rose between 1703 and 1706. Every piece of carved stone, every classical column, every decorative urn and cherub was placed with care, building not just a house but a legacy. But the construction spanned more than a century, and it spanned the lives of 3 Earls of Carlisle. Each generation had its own vision, its own ideas about how the house should be completed. The result was a structure that defied architectural unity. The West Wing, completed decades after the East Wing by Charles Howard's son-in-law Thomas Robinson, was built in the Palladian style, crisp and classical, fundamentally different from Vanbrugh's exuberant Baroque. When critics pointed out that the north front used Doric columns while the south front used Corinthian, Hawksmoor famously retorted that no one could view both fronts at the same time. It was a clever deflection, but it revealed the truth. Castle Howard was not one vision but many, a house built by committee across generations, each earl trying to put his own stamp on the structure. The interior was even more ambitious than the exterior. The Great Hall rose 70 feet to the painted dome, where Giovanni Antonio Pellegrini's masterpiece, The Fall of Phaeton, depicted the classical myth of the boy who tried to drive his father's sun chariot and fell burning from the sky. It was a fitting allegory for the Howard family itself, ambition reaching too high, crashing back to earth in flames. The state apartments were decorated with baroque splendor. Tapestries woven specifically for Castle Howard in 1706 by John Vanderbank depicted the four seasons in scenes from the paintings of David Teniers. These were not merely decorations, but expressions of wealth and taste, costing sums that would bankrupt lesser families. The Long Gallery, decorated between 1801 and 1811, stretched the length of the West Wing, lined with paintings collected on the Grand Tour, the ritual journey through Europe undertaken by wealthy young Englishmen to acquire culture and antiquities. By the time Castle Howard was completed in 1811, over a century after construction began, the estate had grown to encompass more than 13,000 acres. It included entire villages: Welburn, Bulmer, Slingsby, Terrington and Coniesthorpe. Tenant farmers worked Howard land. The estate had its own railway station from 1845 until the 1950s, connecting this private domain to the wider world. The Howards who lived at Castle Howard were different from their Tudor ancestors. They were reformers, intellectuals and eccentrics. Lady Dorothy Georgiana Howard, daughter of the 9th Earl, was known as the Radical Countess. While attending Girton College in the early Edwardian era, she befriended 6 fellow students, including future archaeologist Gisela Richter and future Roman Catholic candidate for sainthood Anna Abrikosova. She invited all of them to Castle Howard for the holidays, bringing the wider world into the Yorkshire countryside. But this branch of the Howard family was not immune to scandal and tragedy. The women of the family, in particular, faced difficult relationships. Rosalind Howard, Countess of Carlisle, was a noted philanthropist who found it easier to love and understand other people's children, particularly underprivileged ones, than her own. Her relationship with her sons was disastrous. One after another, she quarreled with Charles, Hubert, Christopher, Michael, and Oliver. The rows were about politics, money, drink, girls, ideas, everything and nothing. It was a family fractured by ideology and temperament, held together only by the house itself. Through it all, Castle Howard endured. It survived the transition from private residence to public attraction. It survived changes in fashion and fortune. It became one of the treasure houses of England, a monument to baroque architecture and aristocratic ambition. Visitors came to marvel at the dome, the gardens, the magnificent collection of art and antiquities gathered over centuries. And then, on November the 9th, 1940, Castle Howard nearly died. It started in the early morning, in the southeast corner of the south front. A chimney fire, a common enough occurrence in a house heated by hundreds of fireplaces. But this fire did not stay contained. Fanned by strong Yorkshire winds, it spread through the building with terrifying speed. Castle Howard was not empty that morning. It was serving as the temporary home of Queen Margaret's School, a girls' boarding school evacuated from Scarborough as the Second World War raged across Europe. Over 100 schoolgirls slept in the great staterooms, their dormitories carved out of apartments once reserved for visiting royalty. As the fire spread, chaos erupted. The girls were evacuated, stumbling out into the cold November morning as smoke billowed from the windows. But they did not flee empty-handed. With remarkable courage, these teenage girls ran back into the burning building again and again, rescuing what they could. Paintings by Lely, Tintoretto, and Rubens were carried out into the gardens. Sculptures and furniture were dragged through smoke-filled corridors. They saved what they could, but they could not save everything. The fire roared through Castle Howard for 8 hours. Local fire brigades fought desperately to control it, but the scale of the building defeated them. They managed to save the east and west wings, but the central block, the heart of Vanbrugh's creation, was gutted. At mid-morning, The dome collapsed. Witnesses described it as apocalyptic. The dome blazed like a beacon, visible for miles across the Yorkshire countryside. Molten lead from the roof cascaded down into the great hall below, a waterfall of liquid metal. The timber supports burned like matchsticks. And then, with a roar that shook the ground, the entire dome crashed inward, falling into the great hall in an inferno of blazing timber and shattered stonework. Pellegrini's masterpiece, The Fall of Phaeton, that allegory of ambition crashing to earth in flames, was destroyed. The great hall became an open pit, exposed to the sky. 20 rooms were completely gutted. The collection of fine china, accumulated over generations, exploded like firecrackers in the heat. Chippendale mirrors shattered. Westmacott's statue of Venus melted. 12 overdoors by Marco Ricci were consumed by flames. The magnificent stucco overmantel in the high saloon, the work of Italian stuccoist Giovanni Bagutti and Signor Plura, was reduced to rubble. When the fire was finally extinguished and the damage assessed, the southeast wing and main block were gutted. The roof was gone. Windows were empty holes in smoke-blackened stone. Castle Howard stood like a corpse, a hollow shell that had once been magnificent. Miraculously, there had been no loss of life, no injuries beyond minor smoke inhalation. But the house itself seemed mortally wounded. For years after the fire, Castle Howard stood unroofed and exposed to Yorkshire weather. Rain poured through empty windows into rooms that had once hosted kings and dukes. The dome remained collapsed, the great hall open to the sky. Some urged the family to abandon the house, to tear it down and build something new. The cost of restoration seemed impossible. Britain was at war. There was no money for such extravagance. Castle Howard appeared doomed to join the long list of English country houses destroyed by fire and never restored. But the Howards had survived worse than fire. They had survived executions and political disgrace, religious persecution and civil war. They had endured for centuries through sheer stubborn determination, and they were not about to let a fire defeat them. George Howard, who inherited the estate after his 2 brothers were killed in World War II, made the decision that saved Castle Howard. He would keep the house. He would restore it. And to fund that restoration, he would open Castle Howard to the public. In 1952, for the first time in its history, ordinary people could walk through the doors of Castle Howard and see for themselves what the Howards had built. They could climb the grand staircase and walk through rooms that had survived the fire. They could see the damage, the gutted staterooms, the missing dome, and they came in their thousands, drawn by curiosity and by the chance to glimpse a world usually hidden behind aristocratic walls. The restoration work began slowly. In 1960, the dome was rebuilt. By 1962, it was complete, crowned once again with a painted ceiling. This time, a recreation of The Fall of Phaeton by artist Scott Mead. It was not the original, but it was a faithful homage, returning the Great Hall to something approaching its former glory. Through the 1970s, restoration continued. Jim Russell's distinguished collection of rhododendrons and azaleas was planted in Ray Wood. An arboretum was created, now so important that it is partly managed by the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. Slowly, painstakingly, Castle Howard was being brought back to life. Then, in 1981, something unexpected happened that would secure Castle Howard's future and transform it from a stately home into a cultural icon. The BBC chose Castle Howard as the location for their adaptation of Evelyn Waugh's novel Brideshead Revisited. The television series was a phenomenon. Millions of viewers watched Charles Ryder's first glimpse of Brideshead, seeing Castle Howard's dome and fountains transformed into the fictional home of the Flight family. The show captured something about English aristocracy in decline, about beauty slipping away, about a world that had survived the war but would never be the same. And at the center of it all was Castle Howard, magnificent and melancholy, a character in its own right. The income from filming helped fund further restoration. The garden hall was reconstructed. The new library was completed. Rooms that had been boarded up since the fire were gradually brought back to life. Castle Howard became Britain's most famous country house, known around the world not just for its architecture, but for its appearances on screen. But even as restoration progressed, much remained undone. Almost an entire wing of the house still required extensive work. The costs were staggering, running into millions of pounds. The current generation of custodians, Nicholas and Victoria Howard, faced difficult decisions. To fund ongoing restoration, they had to sell parts of the family's collection, including precious Fabergé animals at auction. Each sale was painful, but necessary. In 2022, the Howards embarked on their most ambitious restoration project yet, the complete recreation of the tapestry drawing room. This had been one of the 20 rooms gutted by the 1940 fire. For over 80 years, it had remained a scorched shell, a reminder of that terrible morning when fire nearly destroyed everything. The decision to restore the room was controversial. The Georgian Group and the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Buildings objected, arguing that the gutted room told the story of the fire, a major event in the building's history. There were no original drawings showing how the room had looked, particularly the imposing fireplace. How could they recreate something without knowing exactly what they were recreating? But Chris Ridgway, the head curator at Castle Howard since 1984, rejected these arguments. Castle Howard had no shortage of fire-damaged interiors. An entire wing still bore the scars. The story of the fire did not need to be told in every gutted room. More importantly, they had the tapestries themselves, the 4 panels woven specifically for this room in 1706, depicting the seasons. The tapestries had survived because they had been moved to another room before the fire. Now, they would return to their original home. The work was meticulous and painstaking. Architects Francis Terry led the project, working with designers Remy Renzullo and Alec Cobb. They pored over the Castle Howard archives, one of the most complete collections of estate papers in England. They found bills of sale, letters describing the room, inventories listing its contents. Piece by piece, they reconstructed what had been lost. The tapestries themselves required careful restoration. One showed a little dog scampering across a wintry landscape, but the vertical seams revealed that the dog had once been chopped out when the tapestries were cut down to fit a different room. These were not pristine museum pieces, but objects that had been used, moved, altered over 3 centuries. Their imperfections were part of their history. In April 2025, the restored tapestry drawing room opened to the public. For the first time since 1940, visitors could see the room as it had been meant to be seen, complete and magnificent. The 4 Vanderbank tapestries hanging in their original positions, framed by gilded plaster and lit by the Yorkshire sun streaming through restored windows. Nicholas Howard promised to find a quiet evening, take a book, and sit by the brand new fireplace to relax and enjoy the space that had been lost for his entire life. For him, it was not just restoration, but resurrection, bringing back to life a part of his family's history that he had only known as ruins. The restoration continues. Almost an entire wing still needs work. The costs are staggering, the challenge is immense. But the Howards, as they have for centuries, endure. They adapt, survive, and somehow find a way forward. Today, Castle Howard encompasses over 3,000 hectares of parkland, gardens, woodlands, and villages. It is classified as a Grade 1 listed building, the highest level of historic protection. It appears on Historic England's Buildings at Risk register because such a massive structure requires constant conservation work, constant vigilance against decay. But it is also a living, working estate. Nicholas and Victoria Howard live in part of the house, maintaining that strange duality of family home and public attraction. Visitors come in their hundreds of thousands to walk through state rooms and gardens, to see the dome that was destroyed and rebuilt, to imagine the lives lived within these walls. Castle Howard has appeared in countless films and television series. Stanley Kubrick filmed scenes from Barry Lyndon here in 1975. The 2008 film adaptation of Brideshead Revisited returned to Castle Howard, showing a new generation the house that had captivated audiences decades before. Castle Howard appeared in Netflix's Bridgerton as Cliverton House, the residence of the Duke of Hastings, introducing the house to an enormous global audience. But the true story of Castle Howard is darker and stranger than any fiction. It is the story of a family that produced two queens and sent both to the scaffold. A family that survived through adaptability and ruthlessness, bending but never breaking. A family that gambled everything on architectural ambition, creating a palace in the Yorkshire countryside that took over a century to build. It is the story of a house that nearly died in 1940, consumed by fire, its dome crashing down in flames like Phaeton falling from the sky. And it is the story of resurrection, of generation after generation refusing to let it die, pouring money and effort and love into restoration, keeping the house alive against all odds. The Howards of Castle Howard are no longer the Dukes of Norfolk. That title remained with the senior line, still the Premier Dukes of England, still holders of the office of Earl Marshal. But this cadet branch created something the main line never did. They created a house that has become part of England's cultural heritage, a monument that transcends one family's ambitions. Yet even now, in the 21st century, scandal has touched the family. In 2022, Simon Howard, who had managed the estate for decades, faced criminal charges relating to historic offences. He denied the allegations, but the shadow fell across the family nonetheless, a reminder that proximity to power and fame brings not just privilege but scrutiny. Through it all, Castle Howard endures. It stands on its hill in Yorkshire, visible for miles, its dome once again crowned with painted glory. The gardens bloom in spring and summer. The fountains play. Visitors walk through rooms where girls from Queen Margaret's school once slept, where they ran through smoke and flame to save treasures from the fire. They see the tapestry drawing room restored to baroque splendor, and they see the gutted wings still awaiting restoration, the scars of 1940 still visible after 85 years. Castle Howard is England's most powerful mansion, not because of the dukes and earls who built it, not because of the queens who died wearing the Howard name, not even because of its architectural magnificence. It is powerful because it endures. It survives fire and war, scandal and financial crisis, the rise and fall of aristocratic power. It survives because generation after generation, the Howards have refused to let it die. And perhaps that is the darkest truth of all, that this magnificent house, this baroque palace, was built on ambition so fierce it consumed lives, and survives through determination just as fierce. The Howards learned long ago that survival requires sacrifice. Sometimes that sacrifice is a daughter sent to be queen. Sometimes it is a niece condemned to die. Sometimes it is a precious Fabergé collection sold at auction. But always the family endures. Always Castle Howard stands. The house refused to die. The family refused to let it. And so, 325 years after John Vanbrugh, a playwright who had never built anything, began designing a palace for Charles Howard, 3rd Earl of Carlisle, Castle Howard remains. It is both a family home and a place at which to marvel, a monument to ambition and survival, to the glory and the darkness of English history. If you've enjoyed discovering the dark secrets and incredible history of Castle Howard, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from England's most mysterious and magnificent historic houses. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. The dome still rises above the Yorkshire countryside, visible for miles. The gardens still bloom. And Somewhere in the restored tapestry drawing room, perhaps on a quiet evening, Nicholas Howard sits with a book by the fireplace, in a room that was dead for 85 years and has been brought back to life. The house that refused to die, the family that would not surrender. This is Castle Howard. This is England's most powerful mansion. And this is its dark, enduring story.